Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the Integrated Green Economy Modeling Framework on behalf of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform Secretariat. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to provide a few words of introduction about the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, or the GGKP. Established a few years ago by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, United Nations Environment, and the World Bank, the GGKP is a global partnership of over 55 leading international organizations, research institutes, and think tanks committed to collaboratively generating, managing, and sharing green growth knowledge and data. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention that the 5th GGKP annual conference will be taking place from the 27th to 28th of November, hosted this year by the World Bank in Washington, D.C., on the theme of building sustainable infrastructure. Over 40 papers on the topic of sustainable infrastructure will be discussed at the conference. We hope that many of you will be able to join what will certainly be an extremely informative event. As for today's event, we are delighted to be hosting this webinar in collaboration with the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, otherwise known as the PAGE Initiative. The PAGE Initiative draws together 5 UN agencies: UN Environment, the International Labour Organization, UN Development Programme, UN Industrial Development Organization, and the UN Institute for Training and Research to support countries that are interested in pursuing sustainable economic development. Today's joint webinar is actually the second in a 2-part series. The first webinar, which took place on the 20th of September, focused on the PAGE Initiative's work to develop national-level green economy indicators and the new Green Economy Progress Measurement Framework. In today's webinar, we'll be introducing the PAGE Initiative's Integrated Green Economy Modeling Framework, which responds to country requests for tools to analyze the cross-sectoral as well as the environmental and social impacts of green policies and investments. Before introducing our esteemed moderator for today's webinar, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. Firstly, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then share them with all participants for our panelists to address during the question and answer period. We'll also be circulating a survey after this webinar, and I would encourage you to complete it, as this provides us with valuable feedback to help shape our future webinars. Finally, if you have any technical issues with this webinar, please email us at contact@ggkp.org, and we will help you troubleshoot through them. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Carlo Carraro. Dr. Carlo Carraro is a professor of environmental economics at Ca' Foscari University of Venice, where he served as president from 2009 to 2014. He also serves as vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3. He is director of the International Center for Climate Governance at FEAM, the president-elect for the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, and, alongside Alice Caudia, serves as the co-chair for the GGKP Advisory Committee. Carlo, it is with great pleasure that I now turn this moderation over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. I hope you will be able to see me very soon. Okay, here I am. Thank you, and thank you in particular all those who are attending this webinar. It's an important webinar. It's important at least for 2 reasons. One is the distinguished speakers that we're going to listen in a few minutes. We have 3 very important speakers: Jose Pineda, who is professor at the University of British Columbia; Daniela Torre Ugarte, who is professor at the Universidad de Pacífico in Lima; and Eric Benedict, who is a researcher and professor at the Stockholm Environmental Institute. But most importantly, this webinar will be very useful because it provides information, very useful information, on something which is quite important, not only for professors, researchers, scholars, but in particular for those who are working on sustainable development, on the green economy, and all those issues that are related to improving the welfare and the environment of our societies. And this is the right modeling tools that we should use in order to get the right information, the right scenarios, and the right strategies, the right policies to address some very important issues related to sustainability. In particular, I believe that all of you, all those who are listening to this webinar, have in mind problems like choosing between different indicators or different sustainable development indicators. We have 17 indicators, many different targets, and it's quite complicated not only to measure these goals, but also to identify trade-offs and identify priorities. Today we will listen to a description of instruments that can help this kind of process. But more than that, in order to achieve these goals, we need to define policies. Identifying these policies is a complex issue because they are often quite interrelated and they have positive and negative implications. And again, the tools we are going to listen to, the description of these tools, will be very helpful to understand how to select policies that provide benefits, and these benefits overcome the cost of these policies. Implementing policies require investments. Again, what's the size of these investments? What are the implications and the economic consequences of these investments? The tools, the models that will be presented will be very helpful also to address issues of identifying the size of the investments and the implications, the economic implications of these investments. And then finally, we need something which is easily understandable, that can easily be presented to policymakers. And I believe that the effort that's been done by the colleagues that are going to talk today, but also by all the teams that are behind the PAGE program that Jennifer presented before, is relevant exactly because it is not only useful in terms of results, but it's also an easy tool that can be used to present these results to policymakers and civil servants, business leaders, institutions, in order to provide these institutions, these leaders and these policymakers with appropriate information to take the right decision. And that's why I'm very pleased to moderate this webinar, and I'm very pleased to give the floor, first of all, to Jose Pineda. Jose Pineda, as I said, is professor at the Soder School of Business of the University of British Columbia, and he served as senior researcher at the UNDP Human Development Report. He has been working on providing support for policies in developing countries for many years, and he certainly has the appropriate information, the right skills to help us in this difficult process that I just described, what kind of tools or kind of models can be used to address, to select priorities, to address the policymakers' needs, to support the implementation of the right policy, in particular in developing countries. Professor Pineda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlo. Let me see if I'm able to. Well, I just want to do a brief introduction, a little bit of background of why we have supported this line of work. And this is a continuation of the efforts that have been done from UN Environment, because since the launch of the Green Economy Report in 2011, UN Environment has understood the important need to support the efforts that countries are doing in developing their green economy policy assessment tools. So for us, it is at the core of our understanding how we can make progress in shaping and changing policy making, the use of modelings. We have done green economy policy assessments in many countries, and some examples are South Africa, Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Uruguay, Ghana, Mauritius, Mozambique, Mongolia, and recently Peru, and we will talk a little bit about that later on during the webinar. With the exception of Mauritius and Mozambique, we have mostly used the threshold 21 model, which is a system dynamic model. Also, we will call it a short T21. And this is a system dynamic model that includes endogenously links across different economic, social, and environmental aspects of development. And the whole idea is to include them in a relatively complex but rich set of feedback loops. What we have done is to take a stock to see what we have learned about the application of this modeling work to support the green economy policy assessments. And we have decided that given the complexity of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, given the richness of the mandate of that agenda and the request of governments asking us more and more complex policy questions, that it will be great to embark on a project of enriching our modeling tools to adjust to the policy needs. And that's pretty much what we wanted to talk today, and we will be talking later on in more detail about the process of the creation of this integrated green economy modeling framework, or IGEM. So I want to stop here just to give a brief introduction on how we conceive this project to be done within the UN Environment and PAGE framework.
Thank you very much, Jose. We have a small problem. We need to change slightly the agenda because Daniel is not yet here. He will join us in 10 minutes. So what I suggest is to shift the agenda and cover the Mexico case first, and then move to the Peru one later. These two cases are very useful because they, on the one hand, they present the methods that have been applied to the Peru case, and Daniel will talk to us about this, and the modeling tools that have been used in Peru is something that, in Mexico, sorry, is something that you, Daniel, will, that you or Jose will be able to do. So I suggest that you go on with the Mexico case and the modeling of the Mexico and the green economy and so on and so forth. And then when Daniel gets connected, we move to Daniel and listen to the Peru case. Is it okay?
Perfect. Just give me one second. I'm here with my. Okay, I will be able to show my screen. I don't know if I hope I selected the right thing. So. I think it's also a good way to follow up the initial introduction that I did. So this integrated green economy modeling framework is a result of, as I said before, this complex, increasingly complex request from governments that they wanted to have policy, a policy that is according to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is more complex, is more rich, so they need to have modeling tools that are adapted to those realities. But also, I think it is important to understand that at the core of good green economy policymaking, or any policymaking at all, modeling has to be at the core. So what we have decided is, instead of creating a gigantic new model that will have all the complexities from the SDGs, why not articulating many of the modeling techniques that we have available, many of which are already being developed and are well used in many of the countries that we are supporting, so that we create a framework in which we help these models, different modeling tools to communicate. So what we have done is to do the transition from just focusing on the T21 to having what we call the IGEM framework. And the idea is to add to the system dynamics, to the T21 modeling tool, two other important modeling tools that will enrich the analysis. One is the Computational General Equilibrium models, which could be very useful to do economic policy analysis in detail, will be very useful to understand in great detail economic interlinkages across sectors. It will be very useful to understand some of the general equilibrium implications of some of the policies. So it will enrich the work that we have been doing in terms of the economic side of the T21. And in addition, we wanted to enrich the modeling by having input, output, and social accounting metrics information and the framework of these tools, because this will be at the core of greening all the modeling tools that we will have. So the idea, instead of creating a super big model, will be trying to see how we can combine many of these tools to enrich the set of policies that we will be able to analyze. So this is just a very simplistic schematic, how the green input, output, and social accounting metrics will be able to provide information that will fit both the CGE and the system dynamics, and those will create a framework in which we will start creating the linkages between these models. And one of the purposes will be to concentrate some of the economic analysis into the CGE, which is richer, and let the system dynamic, the T21 model, to handle the complex causal relationships that we will see on the environmental and social aspects. So we consider the IGEM framework to add value, I think, into main areas of modeling for policymaking. One is that the project and the framework try to help how to green some of the main modeling tools, the input, output, social accounting metrics, the computational general equilibrium models, and the system dynamic models. So the first stage of any modeling that we conceive within this framework will be to have greening this kind of models. And I will talk a little bit about that in 1 second. The second one is a methodology to articulate them, and that will be the integrated part of the IGEM framework. Okay, so to green an input, output, social accounting metrics model, the whole idea is to work on the disaggregation of green sectors, and that will be at the core of all the modeling tools to adequate them to do green economy policy analysis. And there are two steps of any of this disaggregation. The first one, try to concentrate in the disaggregation of the conventional input-output metrics that we have in order for us to have a detailed presentation of the green sectors in the economy that we want to model, the sectors that we are interested to do policy analysis. And according to those results, we need to construct social accounting metrics that will be consistent with that disaggregated input-output model. This is just to illustrate one example that, for instance, if we have sector N, in which we could do a disaggregation between the green, let's say this is the energy sector, and we could decompose the part that is more fossil fuel, carbon intense aspect, and then we can decompose the one that is more green, more renewable. Well, the idea will be to work into the input-output metrics to do the disaggregation, but that disaggregation will require a lot of information, a lot of work in order to to be able to replicate in a complete fashion and an integrated fashion the line that will be corresponding to the green sector. After we have that, we need to work then in expanding our social accounting metrics, and the idea will be to use the results that we have from the previously extended input-output matrix to use a series of ratios and proportions that will help us to do the expansion of the consistent social accounting metrics so that we can mimic the disaggregation that we did with the input-output in terms of the social accounting metrics. We can also do applications in terms of extensions using the input-output SAM framework to work on spatial considerations, and this could be done at the international level, and there are some interesting applications with the GTAP project, but also could be done internal within a country to do regional analysis of the impact of some of the green economy policies. The second kind of work is greening the CGE model, the Computational General Equilibrium models, and the idea is that we use the expansions that we did in the input-output SAM matrices to enrich the CGE model. And the idea will be that this green input-output SAM matrix that we have will be used to improve the calibration and the data. Of course, it will help to disaggregate the production function within the CGE model, and it will help to, for instance, to disaggregate one of the key sectors in any CGE model, and a key sector to understand green policies, which is the energy sector. So the idea will be to use the green input-output SAM that we have just developed and help with that information to green and to enrich the CGE model. I think the idea in this is to use the information coming again from the input-output SAM that we has just worked to green it, to incorporate that information into the CGE model. Equivalently, we can do the same with the system dynamic model, the T21 model, and we could try to do it in a way in which each model will preserve its own individual characteristic, but is able to develop sectors and to disaggregate sectors that will allow future communication with other models. So the whole point here again is to use information from the green input-output SAM matrices and use those to disaggregate and to add information to disaggregate green sectors within the system dynamics. So as you can see, at the core of linkage in the models is how we can work in greening the input-output and SAM matrix, and how this will help us to green either the CGE or the system dynamics model. When we want to integrate the CGE and the system dynamic model, which is the more complex kind of interaction, it will be very useful for us to coordinate in this series of parameters, key parameters, that the more common they are between the two models, the easier it is to do the coordination and to integrate them. Having a series of initial conditions that are similar across models would also help. We need to see what are the critical variables that we wanted to have in common and to follow their trend. Why? Because this will help us in the calibration of each of the models, and then the communication, the future communication of these models. In terms of the particular linkages, we have conceived two kind of linkages, and the difference between the linkages, if they are soft or hard linkages, is mostly about how integrated you really want the models to be. So the most frequent that you could implement, and the easier, I think the easier way to go will be to do the soft linkages, because the soft linkages just require articulation into the outputs that you are getting from each of the models. For instance, you could run the CGE model and then feed that information into the system dynamics and then run the system dynamics and feed back that information to the CGE, and you can run a series of loops in that sense. That is a relatively convenient, and that's what we have applied in the case of Mexico, that I will briefly talk in a few minutes. But the whole point here is that these soft linkages, it could be implemented even if modelers are not exactly in the same place. And that's ideal, for instance, for government coordination, in which you have, let's say, the Ministry of Production that has a particular model, and let's say a CGE, and then you have the Ministry of Planning having a system dynamic model, and then you have the central bank or any other institution with input, output, and sign matrices, where you could articulate all of these modelings that are already in place within the government by running these soft linkages. The hard linkages is a little bit different, but requires a little bit more integration, and it requires that you run it after each interaction, and you may require a little bit more work on the manually coupling of all the results, and that may be a second stage in which you have in-house modelers with different skills within one institution, and then they can work more in a more integrated way. But in any case, I think the linkages that the IGEM is conceiving is able to help the articulation of these different models. So this is just a representation of this complex articulation in which the input-output SAM will provide information to bring the system dynamics and the CGE, and they will be exactly articulating in these linkages between one model and the other, sending information to both of them. I just wanted to add in the general case, before I use a couple of additional minutes to talk about the application to Mexico, is what approaches can be taken to do this model. One is the target-driven approach, and the other is the investment-driven approach. And why we try to have the models open to both? Because sometimes policymakers may have, let's say, a particular target that they want to achieve. Imagine in the framework of the SDGs, countries would like to reduce, I don't know, emissions, or they want to increase the share of renewable energy by a certain amount. Well, the target-driven approach will be useful to use modeling to assess that. Or in other cases, countries say, I have a commitment to invest this amount of money or this amount of resources, this percentage of GDP. Well, then what will be the impact that this will have? And that will be the investment-driven approach. And what I have here is how we think this could be articulated. So we have a target in CO2 emissions, and how this will translate to cost, and how this will give information in the input-output, and how this will create loops between the two models. And the same can be done when we have the price. Price could be just a tax or a subsidy policy, or an investment, which is a certain amount of money. So these feedbacks could also be created if we say, I have, let's say, a carbon tax, or I have an investment in renewable energy of this 2% of GDP, how this will translate, and the numbers that you see here and the arrows are reflecting the articulation that we can do across the different models. Okay. So let me briefly, and I will appreciate, Carlo, that you tell me when I know I'm relatively close to my time, but if you can remind me when I at least have a couple of minutes left to do that. So the application in the case of Mexico was that we wanted to explore how this framework, how this greening of the models could be applied. And we have conversations with the government of Mexico about evaluating with this tool what could be the implication of the recently introduced carbon tax that they have. So the carbon tax that they have applied is only applied to fossil fuels, and the price that they have is approximately $3.5 per ton of CO2 equivalent. So this was the scenarios that we run. We run in a scenario number one, which is the low tax that they have. We run another one, which is an alternative, which will be using kind of the average of the carbon tax at the OECD countries. And the first two are scenarios in which we do it fiscal neutral, so that we rebate all the amount of taxes to the public. And in the second round of the scenarios, we use the fiscal revenues to fund investments on green economy. So that those are the what we call the investment kind of scenarios. And we compare all of these, of course, with a business as usual model. These are kind of the individual results from a CGE model, and I will quickly go over them because I wanted to enrich to discuss more when we integrate the two. But the whole point is that we will see an increase on renewable energies, or an increase on electricity production, and a decrease on oil, for instance, oil production, natural gas, all of the main results compared to the business as usual. What we have when we compare column 1 and column 2, what we have is a big difference between when we do just a rebate, or when we reinvest results and we reinvest resources into the renewable energy sector, and those are the ones in which we can have higher GDP growth, of course, because we not only have the negative effect of any tax, which is a reduction in production, but also we use the money to reinvest into the renewable energy sector, and that will create additional economic growth. One important issue that we could see is that with the richness of the CGE model that we have, we are able to see the impact in each of the agents. So the poorest, we have the groups separated by desires. We could see how these policies may be affecting also the distribution across agents. When we look at the system dynamic model, the system dynamic model helps us to see how the results will impact this is the business as usual. So if we don't do any policy, emissions will start increasing in Mexico. But when we start doing policy, we will see that the share of renewables, which is this green line, will start increasing, and we will see that the production of coal and others will be significantly reduced. Of course, these are results which are, let's say, taken from each individual kind of modeling. As we can see here, the results in terms of increasing the share of renewables are substantial in terms of how we can use this policy of taxation with increasing. If we can compare, for instance, panel A and panel B, we could see that if we have just a $3.5 per ton, the increase in the share of renewables will happen. But if we increase substantially that tax, we could make progress, substantial progress. We could even reach around 75% of the share of energy coming just from renewables. So one of the key messages was that if you want really to have a significant change in policy, you have to have a higher tax rate, and that will really separate the effects of your policy from the business as usual, which is the blue line. So to summarize, I think the idea is that we have run the models separately, the system dynamics, the CGE, all of them enriched with the input-output SAM framework that allows us to green them. But the results, or the most interesting part was one when we allowed, for instance, the system dynamic model to give us information about reduction or the improvements that the reduction in CO2 emissions will have on health, and how this will translate into higher longevity and higher productivity growth, and how that will create second round effects into the CGE model. And the whole idea was to use these loops to have not only the first round effect, but this second round gains that we could have from implementing policy. I think I'm running out of time, so what I wanted to summarize the results here is that if we have with the last column, which is the IGEM simulations, what is important here is that if we have a model that allows us not only to reinvest the flow of resources that we get from the tax collection into green investments, but also we have a model that allows to have these feedbacks between improvements in health due to the reduction in emissions, so that if we have this positive feedback on productivity, we could see that the effects of the policy will be larger and richer. So to conclude, I wanted to say that the main goals that we have achieved with this application for the case of Mexico of the IGEM framework is that we have been able to create a better, greener models that allowed us to do a policy analysis, and in the case of Mexico was to analyze the implication of a carbon tax using different contexts, but also it allowed, on the coupling side, it allowed us to integrate these models and to be able to create linkages that could articulate them in a way that then the number of policy questions that we could answer with the policy analysis will be larger and richer. And the most interesting case that I wanted to highlight is the one in which we allow this additional second round effect from the policy, the carbon tax that will reduce emissions, from increasing and improvement in health, longevity, and then productivity gains that will also create additional economic growth. So I will stop here. Sorry if it took me a little bit longer than I anticipated, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Jose. In reality, we got many questions. So rather than moving to Daniel, I would like to give the floor to our audience and raise the questions that I received on the screen. And there are really many. Let's start from some technical ones. Robert Smith, for example, asks, how is welfare defined? How do you define welfare in the model? Quick answers.
Sorry, I missed the question.
How do you define welfare?
Yes, well, welfare will be defined as the change in real wages that you will get in the economy. So this, in many of these general equilibrium models, you will have defined welfare as the change in the real income in those economies.
And two more questions about comparison between these models and this model and other models. For example, Amri Horsbrings says, how does the IGEM relate to other mainstream macroeconomic models such as MF mode that are used for policy making? Or Annette Gromban, who says, how does this approach compare to integrated dynamic E3 energy economy environment modeling approaches? How can you reply to these questions?
Well, I'm familiar with some of them, but I do not know all the details. But let me tell you what is important of the framework. We need to separate two things. One is the specific modeling tools that we are choosing, which are and we choose these because these are the ones that we have been working the most, but also these are the ones that are kind of mostly used on the field by many ministries of finance or environment. But the IGEM itself is the articulation process between these modeling tools. So instead of adding, let's say, all the general equilibrium complexity into the system dynamic model, or trying to create a CGE model in which we could have a full-fledged environment interrelationships, which I think will create complication of these models without necessarily the gains that we could expect, and even will present some methodological challenges because it is hard to work in some of these levels with these models. We just have to create a framework in which we allow them to communicate to each other so that we can measure, for instance, the relationship between environment, economy, and the social aspects to the system dynamics, in which we could have these complex feedback loops to be already embedded into the model. But then we say, you know what, if we want to know in more detail and more precision what could be the economic impact, let's focus on the results that we will have from the CGE. So each model is independent on its own, and probably some of those frameworks could be independent on its own. But what we have said is that we can use any particular model and try to see how we can integrate, how can we articulate the results so that we can enrich the final number of policy questions that we could answer. So it's more about the articulation across different tools than creating one tool which will have all the aspects included.
Okay. Dirk Heine asks, what types of unemployment and market imperfections are considered in the model?
The Mexican model, which is a model that was developed by two of our experts for the Universidad de Puebla and I think it's Ohio University, if I remember correct. They have included a series of informal sector. So there is some desegregation in the labor market to allow for the presence of informality, which is an important aspect of many developing countries, as is also the case of Mexico. So the details of that desegregation could be found on the report that was recently launched, and I think is available on the Green Growth Knowledge Platform webpage and the on-page webpage. But the whole point is that we allow one of the most important features of the labor market in Mexico, which is the presence of informality, to be also included into the model. And
I have other questions on applications of the model. For example, Steve Arquid asks whether the model has been applied to Mexico yet. And in particular, whether the model has influenced decisions, policy decisions in Mexico.
Well, these are, I will say, a tricky question. I think definitely it has informed the policymakers because these results has been shared with the authorities. Actually, we did the specific policy that we choose was at the request of the authorities of Mexico, and definitely they use this as an input to their decision making. So there are other aspects that they are being considering. There are different elements that will finally make the final decision that they take. But we could say with a definitely yes that this has informed their decision making, and I think we want to think that also has influenced a little bit how they can approach this policy into the future.
And Paul Ofeimano asks about applications in African countries, in particular in Ghana. Do you know about these applications and the effects of these applications?
Well, the way we actually work, and that's also an important part of the philosophy of PAGE and UN environment in particular, is that we work with local authorities, local governments, and also we try to have a local partner, which is a local think tank or a local university or a local research institution, so that we facilitate their own policy-making process. So we have done this in the case of Mexico when we work with the university. We have done this in any country in which we approach to provide support. So in any of these country applications, we have worked closely with the government. We have worked closely with local researchers, so that this is an in-house, totally on as possible by the local authorities.
I have other questions on the features of the model. Robert Smith, for example, asks, will the modeling framework take capital stocks explicitly into account, natural, human, and social capital stocks?
Well, and that's the interesting part of the modeling framework. The system dynamic models can work with the stocks and can work with physical units. So if we are really interested in following up many stocks, which are different from just saying the stock of capital, because investment will be physical capital, investment will be considered in the CGE model. But if you want to follow like natural capital and other aspects of the broader capital accounts, then the system dynamics will be a model that will help us with that. So when we do the articulation, we have information, we can do tracking of many of the physical and biophysical measures by the use of the system dynamic component of the IGEM framework.
And again, about technology and technical challenges, Erika Jorkens asks how you handled these technical challenges when dealing with green economic issues.
Well, I think there are technical challenges in many levels. I think that the way we handled this was to have a coordinated effort in which we work all the different pieces of the modelings that we were handling with regular meetings in which we were able to see what could be the easiest channels of communications between different models, which are even written in different codings and different language, which have different philosophical approaches to modeling. For instance, the CGE is fully embracing the general equilibrium philosophy, while you have the system dynamics that works more like from the supply side of things. So how we were able to even address the challenge of combining these things, the whole point was, instead of creating a new mega model that will be very difficult to even conceptualize, our goal was to see how can we articulate, how can we create channels, variables, indicators that could link the results from one model to the next model, so that we can use all of them instead of using badly all of them. Okay.
And Neus Escobar is asking about sectoral disaggregation. What sectors, how many sectors, is it same as GTAP or is it different?
Well, it is different because it depends on the how well disaggregated this could be for the country. We had, for the case of Mexico, 13, if I remember correct, 13 sectors that were disaggregated. But for instance, it depends on the policy that you want to analyze. So again, the key to the analysis is, imagine that you want to have an analysis of a certain particular industrial policy, let's say. Well, if that's the case, then the main challenge that you need to do is to have your CGE disaggregation and your system dynamic disaggregation so that you can evaluate the policy in a similar way across models. So those are the main challenges that we are facing. And to the key to any disaggregation will be the richness of the input-output SAM matrices that we could have to do so. So these are at the core of greening any of these models.
Yeah, depends country by country.
Yes.
Eric Jorgensen again asks what green issues aside from carbon emissions have been addressed by the IGEM model.
Well, this was an application, and the application, the philosophy that we took was, let's ask the government which policy they would like us to analyze first. And that was the policy, that was the choice of that particular policy. But this model can be done and can analyze, as we said, price, other price considerations. For instance, what will happen if we give a subsidy to the, let's say, green energy sector. Another policy could be what could happen if we want to promote exports of, let's say, a particular natural resource in which we wanted to make that production process greener, so that we want to reduce their carbon footprint. So these are different applications. In fact, we are in the middle of exploring, working with the Peruvian government, and one of the key policies that now they want to understand is industrial policy, and how their industrial policy and the greening of their manufacturing sector could be analyzed. What could be the potential impacts that this may have, not only in the production side, but also on the social and environmental side. So the flexibility will be given by the kind of models that we have and the kind of policy that is relevant to be analyzed in that case.
Do you also have green sector into the model?
Yeah, well, the whole point was that we were, in order, for instance, in order for us to analyze in a better way the impact of a carbon tax, we disaggregated the transportation sector, the energy sector. So we have to separate green components within those macro sectors into the model, so that we could disentangle better the potential channels through which this policy may have an impact. So again, it depends on the specific policy question that people may have, and if that is the case, then given that the specific policy, then you need to work your model to see how you can best address that particular policy question.
Okay, one last question, and then I'll come back at the end with the other question, but we still have many, but we need to give the floor to Daniel. The last question comes from Ursula Folayan, who is asking how easily can the model be applied by NGOs who get involved in monitoring green economies in their own country?
Well, again, it depends on how proficient each of these NGOs are in using the modeling. So, for instance, you will need to have training on working with GAMs and applying that programming to a CGE model, or you need to be proficient in working with medicine and applying those things to coding the system dynamic models. This is if you want to create your model on your own. Of course, after you have the models created, you could, if you're an NGO, you could still see from these different results what could happen if the policy changes. So you could interpret the different scenarios. You could even propose, let's say, why you don't run this scenario. So there are different levels. You could be a user, and the user has some basic knowledge to interpret the different scenarios that these models are run, could propose scenarios to be run, and then the programmers, which are the ones that will actually modify the models to respond to a very specific question. That could be more technical driven, but the other one could be also part of the debate of different applications within any particular concept.
Thank you, Jose. I think that has been very useful, and of course we would need more time, but I hope that at the end, after Daniel and after Eric, we'll have time to answer some of the other questions. Let's give the floor to Daniel de la Torre Ugarte. As I said, he's a professor on natural resource management at the University of Lima in Peru. And he has been working on this Threshold 21 model for the green economy analysis in Peru, and he's going to tell us his own experience, his own results and methods, and see whether his approach can be useful to many other countries and many other institution organizations. So thank you, Daniel. I hope you can get connected, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Carlo. Good morning to. Okay. Okay. Am I on now? Am I on?
Your voice is clear, so you go ahead.
Okay. Well, good morning to everyone, and good afternoon to the ones who are already past noon. We're going to share a little bit of the work that we did here on the application of the T21 framework to the analysis of the green economy policies. Our main objective was to perform an ex-ante quantitative assessment of some policies for the Peruvian economy. It is important for us, at that time, was important for us to take into account and evaluate which modeling tools do we have available here in Peru, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And basically what we found is that most of the modeling tools that we had available in-house, whether it's in universities, in the Ministry of Economy and Finance of the Central Bank, are basically short-term or at the most annual tools. And we wanted to have a longer-term view of the impact of the economy in terms of their business and usual path, and also in terms of the impact of the policies that were going to be simulated. So basically, what we wanted is to take into account or incorporate the virtues or what the T21 framework offered, and first nationalize the framework, come up with a T21 version of the model that was suitable to Peru, and expand that T21 Peru version to analyze green policies. Why the T21 model? What it had to offer from our point of view? First, it was a modeling tool, a system dynamic modeling tools that integrates the economic, the social, and the environmental dimensions. It allows for a lot of modeling flexibility in terms of its ability to incorporate not only feedback loops, but lags and non-linearity. And the T21 model is a module-based model, which allows for a lot of flexibility in terms of developing specific aspects of particular modules or even adding new models. It was a long-term module. It offered the possibility of, like in our case, going to the year 2035 and allow, of course, for the scenario analysis. The good thing about the T21 model was that it will, because it was a general framework, it has already built in some general data from international sources about Peru, which really, for those modules that were not, let's say, focused or had our main attention, allow us to get some information already put into the modeling tool. So these more or less are the modules of the T21 model in the social, the economic, and environmental areas. The red modules are the modules that either we make changes to try to, as I said, nationalize it, and then in the right-hand side are the green, the models in which we focus our attention for the green policies. So we are going just to go very quickly on the changes that we had to do to try to adapt the model to the Peruvian characteristics, to the characteristics of the Peruvian economy. First of all, as we see here in the sector 10, the original T21 model has an industry sector. And within that industry sector, they have, or they add together also the mining sector. Well, the issue in Peru is that mining provides about 50% of our exports, our foreign exchange income. So it was important for us to isolate it, to separate, to model it separately from the industrial sector. And what we did is create a small module in which the mining sector was basically driven from the supply side for the metrics of investment and production projects through the year 2035. So that will allow us to at least manage and simulate what is a current schedule for the implementation of those projects and potential delays or overcost of those projects too. A second area was the commercial balance, the trade balance. The T21 model estimated, the general framework estimates the trade balance as a residual. That means how much that the country produces, how much that the country consumes, therefore whatever is left over can be exported. And we thought that in our case, it's much more convenient to link the export sector to the production level of the sector and the growth of the GDP. Those was two changes that we incorporated. A third one that was very important for Peru was in the government financing aspect. Since about 10 or 12 years ago, the Ministry of Economy and Finance is applying a fiscal adjustment rule that basically limits the amount of the fiscal deficit to 1% of the GDP. So what we wanted is to incorporate that to avoid just the need for fiscal financing in an unlimited basis if the green policies will demand it. So what this means is that if there has to be fiscal investment or financing in particular sectors, that has to be compensated with the reduction of financing in other sectors. Another important area was the agricultural module. The basic T21 has an agricultural module in which agriculture is basically the crop side accounted by cereals and other crops. Well, Peru, if you are not familiar with it, is a very diverse country in terms of geographic, climate, and productive characteristics. So rather than focusing on cereals that are kind of irrelevant for us, what we decided is try to model the agricultural sector by regions. So we took into account the three major natural regions: the coast, basically a desert dry area, the highlands, where most of the rain occurs, and then the Amazon basin. Therefore, we focus on regional production value for each of those regions. The model also, the T21 model also has potential yields as kind of the limit in agricultural production. And because we have so many different crops for which potential yields didn't exist, rather than having a potential yield as a basic driver of how technology could move, what we decided is to generate a very simple Cobb-Douglas production function for each of the three natural areas, the geographic areas in which we divided agriculture. So in agriculture, we basically, because the modular composition of the T21, we were able to basically revamp the whole module without having to deal with making substantial changes in the linkages with the other models. Still, land modules. Land is still a basic input, water, labor, and of course, the value of production. Something similar happened with the water demand and supply modules. As I was saying, in terms of water demand, there's a lack of data on what is population consumption. However, there's a very good data for the consumption of water in Lima, the capital, which has basically 1/3 or more of the total population and is located basically in the desert. So it was a very good proxy for water stress. In terms of the supply of water, rather than focusing on the average rainfall of the country, which in the case of Peru at least is kind of meaningless, what we try is to look at where the rainfall is significant, meaning the rainfall is significant in the highlands, and part of that rainfall flows into the rivers that goes through the desertic area of the coast to the Pacific Ocean, and others go to the Amazon basin. And the Amazon basin was basically considered an outflow of water, meaning that water is not being used and will not be used, although it can be by infrastructure investment transferred to the coastal areas. In terms of greenhouse emissions, we didn't want to have only a model that relates greenhouse emissions to fossil fuels, but to two important elements in Peru, was rice production and greenhouse gases due to deforestation, which is one of our most serious problems that we have, in which we wanted to have an impact. For the case of forestry, in which is an area in which we have an immense amount of resources that could be exploited in a sustainable way, what we wanted is to create a whole new module that will allow to link not only the resource base, but the use of that resource base together with the production or the allocation of ecosystem services or environmental values in terms of the production of carbon, the reduction of deforestation, and others. So the idea was to have a forestry module in which, in one hand, we can make a sustainable use of the potential of that forest, and in the other hand, as a second set of incentives, provide them with the right incentives to generate the services that we thought that were required for the green economy development of Peru. So in this time, rather than show you results here and there, what we wanted to show you is our experience kind of trying to adjust and implement the T21 model into Peru, and at the same time kind of share 4 key lessons learned from this experience. One is the fact that the modular structure of T21 is a great advantage. That modular structure of the T21 model basically allows one to focus on a particular model in which you want to narrow down or go deep, or create a new model and then insert it with the rest of the model. The data and relationships that are already built in the T21 framework provides a good starting point in all modules where local information is not readily available. The calibration process, though, remains a black box. And because it remains a black box in terms of the tools and methodology that is being used to calibrate the model, it makes difficult and time-consuming the process of nationalization of creating a new module. Because as the model is calibrated, if you start making changes in the parameters or the relationship, then the more changes that you make, the model goes out of sync, and therefore you have to recalibrate again. And if you don't have that, if you don't have control of that, that makes for a lot of iterations between us and the Millennium Institute. And finally, as we started to implement the model, when we started, we didn't know in which sectors we were going to focus. So looking today, it will be much more efficient if one can define the sectors in which you want to emphasize and work and to green or generate green policies before you start developing or nationalizing the model, so you know in which sectors, in which modules you have to focus and you have to put most of your budgets. So with that, I just want to thank you for your attention and welcome any questions or comments.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. We are now collecting questions, and certainly there are many more that are coming. And in the meanwhile, I would like to give the floor to Eric and Benedict, who is our formal discussion, even though we got so many questions that we don't even need a formal discussion. But certainly his comments will be very useful to frame the subsequent discussion and also to understand better the features of these two modeling approaches and how useful they can be. Eric, as I said, is a senior scientist at the Stockholm Institute Stockholm Environmental Institute. I'm sorry, and he has been working in many of these projects, in particular on the water, energy, and food nexus, and he will certainly be able to provide us with interesting suggestions and comments. Thank you. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on these very interesting presentations. I guess before I say too much, I'll just say a bit more about my background. I have a physics training, physics PhD, but at the Stockholm Environment Institute I've worked in a variety of other areas, mostly modeling and scenario development. So I've got a few comments, some general ones to start with, that sustainable development challenges differ by location, so I just want to say something positive about GGKP and PAGE and what we saw today, that they're avoiding the one-size-fits-all problem. And T21 in particular, it appears to be a useful model for policy analysis, including relevant dynamics so that it's attractive to countries, and it's flexible, and we observe that it's possible to extend it. I'll also note that the examples that we saw show some evidence of a learning community, and we heard from Daniel some frustration with the black box aspect of the model, even as they were able to modify it. So it's a good sign that there's a learning community. I don't know to what extent GGKP and PAGE is bringing people together to share ideas on a forum. Just a thought. I am curious how GGKP and PAGE and the speakers view the role of models in policy development. And in particular, is there any effort to secure meaningful stakeholder input in model design and interpretation? And I'll say a bit about that as a modeler. So models in policy, model evaluation and validation is always tricky in a policy setting, and there's a basic reason for that. So the standard approach with a model is you calibrate it and then validate it against historical data. But for policy, you are always applying it in a counterfactual future. And so this isn't an easy question to answer. I'm not asking the speakers to just answer it. I'm just saying this is an issue that policy modelers constantly wrestle with, and I'm wondering how that was resolved. A structure represents an interpretation of the system, and that might be contested. So again, how do you invite potentially contrary views? And one reason they might be contested is that models exclude as well as include, and there tends to be a bias, and I say this, like I said, as a modeler, towards modeling what can be modeled, excluding some of the softer factors like expectations, trust, and perceptions of fairness. But those can dominate daily life. they can also strongly influence how acceptable policies are, and are particularly relevant in a transition when people are going to possibly have to change the way they work, produce, consume. So that's a general statement. Then I've got some specific comments and questions for each of the presenters. For the example for Peru, I'd say it's a very nice example of leveraging an existing model and making it appropriate in the context of Peru. And I note the need that was expressed by the speaker, by Daniel, for a modular and adaptable long-run model. So this is possibly a larger demand that's out there, not necessarily limited to T21, because this is a complicated space to work in. But just in general, modular and adaptable long-run models. I do have a specific question, a few specific questions for Daniel. First of all, for exports, switching, I like that, that the balance of payments is not just a residual, but I was wondering how exports are estimated and how vulnerable is the balance of payments to fluctuations in demand and price. I'll also say that although I understand your motivation for introducing a Cobb-Douglas for crops, it makes me nervous because there are real biophysical constraints on yields, and they're not very distant for a lot of crops in a lot of countries, although they are for some crops and in some countries. So I was just wondering which crops did not have potential yield estimates. That's quite detailed, not important if we don't get to that. And a similarly detailed question for forest. For productive efficiency, it wasn't clear to me how it compared to the increment, and therefore to sustainable yield, and then that would direct me towards looking at the standing stock on the land area and not just the total land area for carbon emissions. And finally, just a small puzzle, why only the implementation cost affected conditions for green implementation, and then I was curious how those conditions fed into the CO2 emissions. Again, those are pretty detailed technical questions. We might or might not be able to get to them, and then participants will have their own questions. So I'll ask the moderator to choose, pick and choose, and guide us towards the most interesting questions, and that includes mine. Also, some comments and questions on IGEM. I thought it was a sensible combination of the models, and the results for Mexico were very nice. Like T21, it looks like it can be applied elsewhere. The strategy of combining models, I thought, was a good one. And in response to a question, the speaker mentioned focus on communication, and then I would say by doing that, by focusing on communication between models, you can leverage expertise. I have found this to be a particularly useful policy. Rather than having people become amateur enthusiasts in other fields, you take the models that are used in those fields and focus on getting them to talk. I do have some questions. I was curious how sensitive the results are to the specification of the green cost structures, because my understanding was that you specify the green cost structure and then back out a residual set of coefficients for the non-green part. IO matrices are dense, and so some of those connections aren't inherently about greenness, like buying office supplies or catering lunches, and I mean, just to take some very simple examples. So if you shift from non-green to green and you have not included some of those, then you might understate or overstate the downstream impacts of the shift to the green, to a greener sector. And that also brings up a question: to what extent are the green outputs substitutable? From the description, it sounded like you were talking about improving the operations, but in some cases it can mean changing outputs, and I'm wondering how deeply greenness can penetrate. For example, intermittent renewables can need a physically new grid or smart devices, and I mean, you weren't discussing this, but in the example of a bio-based chemical industry, you might have different platform chemicals, and very broadly, carbohydrates rather than hydrocarbons, and so that affects downstream process as well. And then finally, I have a methodological question. So system dynamics models emphasize out-of-equilibrium processes, while CGE computable states. Those can be reconciled in models. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts, explicit thoughts, about how best to reconcile those two different kinds of assumptions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for sharing with all of us all your comments and suggestions for improving the modeling efforts, both of the T21 modeling approach and the IGEM. Let's go back to Daniel. I think that there are several questions for you, Daniel, and it will be good if you could start answering these questions.
Okay, let's see some of the ones I took note. The first one is, in a nutshell, is how to try to reduce the bias that we can have in building the model and using the model. And obviously, the closer and the isolated that we work on that process, the more that we are going to come up with something that is very biased towards what the researcher is doing. In this case, I think that the objective for the beginning has been to try to open up the process in this implementation of the T21 and now with the IGEM to most of the sectors of the sectors of the public, of the government, and to academia, and then having that opportunity to interact with actual policymakers, policy analysts, and academia. I think that provides, it doesn't ensure of anything, but provides a good sensitive feedback on whether we are directing the model to the results that we want, or we are directing the model to something meaningful. In terms, going to more specific things, in terms of the balance of payments and the impact of the mining, the mining sector, there is no question that in this case, the fluctuation of prices will have a significant impact on the balance of payments. In our particular exercise, what we decided is, in terms of those prices, whatever business as usual scenario we pick for the 2013-2035 period, we pick exactly the same prices to the green scenario analysis. There is no need to have done that. We could have chosen 2 or 3 different price scenarios for mining products that will allow us to look at the vulnerability of the changes due to those changes. So that's something that could have been done, but was not in our radar at that time. Then I just want to finish with the forest. One of the key issues in Peru is that deforestation keeps increasing although at a slowing rate, but it keeps increasing. And one of the issues is that it doesn't matter whether or not we put laws in place. We just have not institutional ability at this point to control it. So the idea is, wait a minute, can we generate enough incentives so the process can be managed, and at the same time focus our attention in terms of controlling or expanding deforestation which is basically driven by agriculture, is not driven by forest activities, but by agriculture, whether we can focus our attention in providing an alternative economic means of achieving a livelihood in that area, so people can shift into the sustainable growth of forestry. And that was kind of the approach that we wanted to model, and whether or not it works will have to be tested. But that's the reason that we went into forestry, looking into that and our limitations in our hands.
Thank you, Daniel. I have a question for you from Ronald Gainza, who is asking whether you can provide more details about the policy that you have simulated in the T20 exercise in Peru.
Okay.
And in particular, how green policies have been selected. How did you select the green policies?
The green policies were, first of all, we make a first selection of which sectors we should prioritize. And that selection was made with in two workshops in which academia, public sector, and NGOs participated. We had a series of indicators in terms of pressure for natural resources, economic impact, employment, possibility of new technology, all of those factors coming into the selection of the sectors. And then, once we define the key sectors, we work with the political authorities in order to see, first, if they already have policies in place in their 5 or 10-year plan that we could take as green policies. So we didn't select the green policies. The green policies were selected by the ministries. We have the example in agriculture, in which the Ministry of Agriculture has already a plan to invest close to $300 to $400 million in developing small irrigation systems for the Andes, for the highlands. So the key element that we wanted to look at that was the growth on income and the reduction on extreme poverty. It was characteristics of the Andes. Another sector was the transportation sector. The transportation sector was the policies in place, that the green policies have to do with the expansion of the public transportation system, with the objective of reducing emissions, improving air quality, and improving the quality of life of the people in terms of reducing their time travel. And then the third one was in the forestry sector. The forestry sector was just kind of what I mentioned, try to manage sustainably a set of acres or extension in forest that is already identified as the more sensitive, try to achieve the highest production or the highest use for that wood, and try to provide an alternative to the agricultural growth that is occurring in that area. So mainly those were the three elements that had an impact in income, had an impact in greenhouse emissions, and had an impact in economic and employment levels for the economy.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. There are common questions with those raised to the IGEM model. In particular, what are the next applications, or do you have other applications of T21 in mind?
Right now, we are in panel discussions, seminars, or with the Ministry of Production, with Produce, in order to apply the T21 to their diversification and eco-efficiency strategy. So what we are trying to agree on is what is within the industry sector, what will be the sector that they would like to look at, and for us to simulate or develop and simulate in T21 to look at alternatives. So that is what is going on right now. And the other is we are trying to strengthen our relationship with the planning commission of the country to provide them with this tool for long-term planning purposes. So we are going into a very specific, which is identify a sector in the Ministry of Production that will lead to a new expansion, and also trying to develop within the public sector the use of the model as a planning tool.
Thank you. Jose, can you ask the same questions? In particular, what kind of application do you plan for the IGEM model? And there is another question. Is the framework available to be used by other researchers? This Adrian Newton was asking whether it can be used by other researchers. That is, it is open access. And what are the applications that you have in mind? We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Let me go to the last first. So in fact, if you go to web page, you will have that we have published the 3 main set of documents and files. One is a document which is an overview, which is more for non-technical people interested, which is an important group that we want also to target, like the question that was made about the engagement with NGOs and others that could be potential users. The second one is the technical document, in which is mostly dedicated to engage other modelers and part of this community of users and researchers that could be interested. And we have also published the main codes that we use for this application. So, of course, these are only people with some technical training will be able to use it, but that will, if you're a researcher doing some of work on this area, you could use some of these codes to inform your own process and your own research. So definitely this is something that we expect to be used in many other countries. As Daniel pointed out, Peru is a country that we have been engaging in how to use some of the modeling tools that are already available, and now with the help of Daniel Millennium Institute and the researchers at the Universidad del Pacifico, T21 is also available in Peru. So we want to use all of these different modeling capacities to help and integrate with models, for instance, held by the Ministry of Production or any other government agency, so that we could use all these tools and make them talk, so that we could learn better from each other. I think that's related to if this can be used for others.
Okay, next application.
Well, the next immediate is Peru. We have also explored in other countries. I think Guyana is a country also that we are exploring to have some work done. So definitely there are many other countries that have been showing interest. Of course, we work with some limited resources, so we need to make sure that we move little by little, but in a steady way. No?
And now the final, most difficult task. You have 2-3 minutes to answer Eric's challenging questions.
Excellent. No, I really appreciate his comment and questions. I will make 2 small comments, and then I will try to answer the best of my capacity his questions. One is related to the role of stakeholders in the policy making and the modeling itself. I think Daniel made a great example of our philosophy when we approach modeling, that it is important to engage different stakeholders, not only from governments, but also from academia, from NGOs. And that was the first thing that we did to even kick off the work at the IGEM application, to replicate part of the groundwork that was done by Daniel and others to do the T21. So I think that's an important aspect that we take really seriously to have a broader stakeholder approach. I think the evaluation of performance, that's an important comment that he made, and I wanted to address that, because this is not perceived as a forecasting exercise. These are more perceived as what if scenarios building, so that we could have a series of counterfactual that will help us to put into a framework the different policies that we are exploring. I think if we want to have more like forecasting performance kind of evaluation, probably we will need to have a different kind of tools to do that. These are more heavily structured and probably just to give us more flavor to interpret the potential implications of some of these policies, but it's more like building scenarios and trying to compare across them some of these counterfactuals. Regarding his questions, I will start with the one that I think is the most difficult, which is how to reconcile the system dynamics with the CGE philosophy. And what we have done is that we try to embrace the most important aspect that each one can offer. So, for instance, working off equilibrium and having this idea of complex feedback loops, I think we found it really powerful from the system dynamic model to do it on the integration of economic with social and environmental aspects. That's something that no economic model can do, and I think that the system dynamic model can offer that integration very, very well. But when we talk about some of the specific economic policies that we wanted to have, and in some cases trade-offs are really important for policy analysis, then we try to rely a little bit more on the information that the CGE can provide from the economic point of view, because in that model, all these trade-offs will be more stretched, of course, by the nature of the model. So that's how at least we conceive with the initial application that we did with Mexico, how we can use these contradictory in principle, but I think the best way to portray is complementary. And finally, I just wanted to say that the exercise of how sensitive are results to the input-outputs matrices and the shifting that we do across sector, I think the key is that we need to have a relatively good input-output disaggregation to actually have results that are meaningful. Because if you don't have that richness, and in some countries there are available at highly disaggregated levels, in many developing countries that's not the case, and we need to struggle with those things. And that's an issue, a challenge that we have now in the application that we want to do for Peru. So that's a challenge, but I think we understand that we need to move forward with the best information that we have available. So I stop here to give a chance to others to comment.
Thank you. In reality, time is over. We are already 10 minutes beyond the time of this webinar, but it was so interesting, it was worth continuing and get your answers to the questions, in particular, Eric, interesting question. So let me conclude by thanking all of you. It was a really nice webinar. All the presentations and comments and questions have been quite useful and stimulating. Let me remind all participants that the presentations, your presentation, Daniel and Jose and Eric, will be available in the GGKP website in the next days, so you can get the presentation again. Let me remind that PAGE is an important initiative of 5 UN organization open to all those who want to get benefits and profit from the tools this initiative has developed. So I stimulate all those who participate in the webinar to become familiar with these tools and try to apply these tools in their own country, in their own context or environmental problems. It's something very important. Let me also say that GGKP is full and rich of documents and tools that can be used by webinar participants and other civil servants and policymakers or experts that need the tools that can be useful for improving the transition to a green economy. GGKP has a wonderful library with tons of documents and a lot of support for policymakers and all those who want to work towards a better world, a more sustainable world, and a greener economy. So let me thank you, all of you. Let me suggest that this is just a first step towards the application of modeling towards the path in favor of a green economy. And let me thank GGKP for having organized the seminar and all participants for the wonderful, stimulating participation. Thank you all.
Thanks.